Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of FGC Behind the Smoke. Really excited for today. We have a really special guest who we've been waiting for a while to get on, and now he's officially on. So Seb, I'll just give you a little introduction here, and then we'll just roll with it, buddy.
Sounds good.
So we have Seb Lavoie. So Seb is a veteran of the RCMP and Canadian Armed Forces with over 2 decades of service, and is now the CEO of Raven Strategic. Seb had various roles within the RCMP, but spent the majority of his career in the emergency response team. So for those of you who are listeners in the States, that would be the equivalent of the SWAT team. And he worked his way up into a leadership position and eventually retiring as a sergeant major in 2021. Seb is also a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, public speaker, co-author of The Warrior and The Garden. He's also a man of faith with a master's degree in counterterrorism and currently completing a master's of theology. So Seb, you're a busy man.
That would be an understatement. I'm not sure I'm doing any of it well, but
but you're doing it nonetheless, right?
Exactly.
That's awesome, man. So yeah, like I said, I'm very appreciative to have you on and for you to take the time out of your day to sit down and chat with me. I got a bunch of different topics I kind of want to go over, and yeah, like I said, really, really excited. So yeah, Seb, why don't we just start with, tell us about where you're from and a bit about your upbringing.
Yeah. So I was born and raised in Montreal, Canada. I actually lived North Shore of Montreal. So I was in Saint Jerome, actually, for those that are maybe knowledgeable of the area. I spent most of my childhood bouncing around from place to place. I was in 11 elementary school, so if that gives you an idea.
Wow.
And mom was on the move, bro.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was, I would say middle class, lower middle class kind of deal, with a mom working a whole bunch of jobs, which left me in charge of a whole bunch of things at a very young age, which it was a blessing, really. It responsibilized me and got me to where I am today, very arguably. And yeah, it was, rougher times to be sort of a mixed kid, sort of in Quebec in the 70s, in the early 70s there. There was some challenges, some adversity with that as well, which again was a blessing because it made me the man I am today. So that is sort of my upbringing in a nutshell, skipping a whole bunch of other uninteresting facts.
So one thing I noticed with you, Seb, that I think is like really inspiring, and I think this is why a lot of people look up to you, but you talk about growing up and the adversity that you faced, and being a mixed race kid growing up in Montreal, and your mom being a single mom and working all these jobs, and yet here you are talking about how it was a blessing. Right, because and I totally get that, because my dad passed away when I was young. So my mom, being a single mother, same kind of thing. She was always really busy, and I had a younger brother, and I had to kind of pick up the slack in certain areas. But it really, I feel, for me, and I'm sure you probably agree, is it kind of makes you the man that you've become.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, sorry for your loss, brother. I feel that deeply. Mom passed away in my arms in 2000 and what year was it now? 2009 on November 22nd or February 22nd, 2009. I mean, it's all blurred out now, but I know what that sort of feels like, unfortunately. But again, another privilege. She could have passed away without me, and here I was, kind of deal. And so, when it comes to adversity, man, like, let's call a spade here. This place isn't meant to be a playground. It's a refining location. As far as I'm concerned, it's a place. It's a place for us to grow. It's a place for us to be refined as individuals. It's a place for us to experience. It's a place for us to explore. It's a place for us to grow. All of those things are needing adversity. It isn't that adversity has to be controlled, that we live in a society where somehow comfort is so important that we are trying to avoid adversity at all costs, and it's costing us massively. If you look at what's going on in the world right now, and the victimhood loop that sort of the entire world seems to be stuck in, kind of deal. And I think that a lot of that is the prevention of adversity and wanting to protect people at all costs against the refining processes of life, which adversity is a big part of. And so when it comes to dealing with adversity from a mental, spiritual, and emotional standpoint, reframing it as something that contributes to your journey rather than takes away from it, not only helps you deal with adversity's past and preventing that victimhood loop sort of falling into, so to speak, but it also prepares you mentally for the next time it happens and your reaction to it, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I couldn't agree with you more. I think in today's society, I think more people need to experience discomfort and adversity. I think comfort has really, in my opinion, like comfort is the killer of productivity, and in a world today where everything is about comfort and is sheltered and realistically, for lack of better words, has gotten soft, it's not doing society any favors in my opinion. And now, so I'm a new father, right? So my son, he's 10 weeks old, and now that I'm a father, I'm really thinking about this type of stuff more, right? Like, I want my kid to experience adversity and to go through some hardships and to learn lessons the hard way, because at the end of the day, it's going to make you more resilient and it's going to make you a better person.
Hmm. Absolutely. And it's an interesting piece with the kids, right? Because it's a fine balance, I would say, right? Because you one of the greatest generations of all times, Generation X, arguably one of the greatest generations ever, a generation that was 30 at 19 and is still 30 at 60, has done a great job of completely ruining Generation Z, by overprotecting them to try to prevent them from experiencing life the way in which we did as Generation X. And I think that was probably the biggest disservice we could have done to this generation. And there's obviously not the generation is not lost. It's not like it's not catastrophic in the sense that none of them will do anything good or anything like that. I mean, that would be throwing the baby out the bathwater for sure. But I do believe that one of the best generations forgot to look inwards and introspect and see, hey, how did we get here? How did we get to this level of resilience? How did we get to be able to be self-sustaining? How did we get to be the way that we are? And what part did adversity play in that? And by me removing adversity from the kids, what does that do? And so now it becomes a question of, how do you mitigate adversity for the kids? Because that is precisely what I intend to do as a dad, of four, and how I will interfere with certain things if they have potentially catastrophic consequences, right? But even then, that is also something that's not nearly as much in our control, and we have only a certain degree of influence. The reality is, some people are born to live to be 7, and others are born to, to live to be 100. And that includes our kids sometimes. And so having the ability to mitigate the adversity that we can, to protect them in places where it could have immediate catastrophic consequences is one thing, but helicopter parenting them and trying to bubble wrap them is probably the worst thing we've ever done as a society. No question.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like you're saying, Seb, like, you want to be able to mitigate certain risks when it comes to your kids and stuff like that, of course. But you're absolutely right. There was a generation that, who went through all these different adversities and stuff like that. And then, I think part of it is they didn't want their kids to have to go through that. So then they try and shelter their kids, but then look what happens, right? And, like I said earlier, I think in today's society, it's done such a disservice in society today where, you have people who are, in their, 20s, early 30s even, who aren't really capable of dealing with anything that's thrown their way that's out of the ordinary, right? And we're seeing it a lot. And, we're constantly seeing stuff on the news, situations happening where people are not willing to get involved and not willing to help out other people because they're too scared or whatever the case might be, which is something that I actually do want to touch on here a little bit further down the line, because you had a post on your social media that really resonated with me and hit home with me, but I want to save that for a bit further because I want to get into a deep discussion about that. But Seb, like growing up for you, growing up with a single mother, I've listened to you on many podcasts. I know your mother was only 15 when she had you, and I'm very sorry for your loss. But statistics show that especially men who are brought up in a single family household without a father figure around are more likely to turn to crime, more likely to end up incarcerated, more likely to die from overdoses, all these sorts of things, right? But you went the opposite way, right? Like you ended up, kind of the next thing that you ended up doing, I think, pretty quick out of high school, was you joined the Canadian Armed Forces. How did you mitigate that for yourself to stay away from going down the wrong path, and to stay away from looking up to the wrong people? Because I think there's a lot of bad people in society who specifically look for young men from fatherless homes and try to prey on them and get them into selling drugs and into gang life and all that kind of stuff. Did you ever have anything like that where people tried to kind of entice you into that world?
Yeah, I didn't need it, but anybody. I did that all on my own. I literally had a dark period or dark season, so to speak, in my youth, between the ages of, I would say, 14 to 18, essentially, where everything went. And I mean, drug use, drug sell, like violence, and I always had a good heart on me, so there was no gratuitous sort of, I wasn't like assaulting random people or doing things like that, but I was always caught up in some stories that would end up in, in some measure of violence. And there was a time where, I was looking for a gun. Like I was looking for a gun. I wanted to sort of have and feel this sort of empowering sort of, or deceivingly disempowering, but it's all a question of appearance and a question of external validation and all of the things that are growing through the minds of a young lack of consequential thinking youth, as a young man that doesn't have a brain that's fully developed and has all these issues. And so, to say that I didn't go down that route is absolutely inaccurate. The fact is, I went down that route and I lucked out, right? Because,
Yeah.
and when I say I lucked out, I mean, in my personal belief system, I believe this was God's path. I believe that there was a reason why I was looked after. I believe that there was something that I needed to repay to the collective. I felt that my entire career, my entire life, and that's why I chose a life of service. But I think that oftentimes the difference between taking a really dark path and having a really good life is essentially the consequences that you suffer as you make the choice initially. Because a lot of people have gone the dark way only to find the light at an unprecedented sort of level, and the other way around as well. And so the day that you start giving yourself, or myself, the day that I start giving myself too much credit for having sort of dragged myself out of that, is the day that I bluntly disregard all of the times that I could have been dead, should have been dead, all of those things, and taking way too much credit for things I have zero credit over. And so, on that, at around the age of 18 is where I started really focusing on a life of service. I did a close protection course, so a bodyguarding course. I was only 18 years old. I joined the military right after, and those two things taught me that, unlike all the things I'd taken on before in my life, it taught me that I could do something that I was truly invested in, that truly gave me a sense of purpose, and something that challenged me to the core, and that I could really do well at if I was in a state of temporary obsession and trying to reach some goals in there. And so that was a blessing all in itself, because there's a lot of people walking around that have no idea what their purpose is.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I'm glad that you shared that with us, because I think as a young man growing up, like I said, in a fatherless household, and there are these temptations and stuff like that, but you've proven that you can really actually turn your life around too. And you dedicated yourself to service, and you were involved in stuff that probably looking back, you probably think like this could have gone a lot worse, right? But here you are today, right? So when you joined the military, was it like, I know you said it was because your passion for service and stuff, but was there some motivation behind it to also eventually go into policing, or was it like you wanted to go into the military, you wanted to go overseas, that's kind of where you saw yourself?
Yeah, no, and great question. The actual purpose behind it was to go into policing. And one of the reasons why that was is because I didn't really have an education at the time. I didn't have a bachelor's degree, or I didn't have a police science or police technology degree or any of that. And in Quebec, it was very difficult to get hired, so-called in the non-conventional way. And there was a way to do it, but generally that involved having a dad that was a sergeant, and I didn't have any of that, going for me, and so I didn't. And all my applications fell on deaf ears, and basically thanks but no thanks. And I got really used to that. I probably got denied in 8 or 9 different organizations, and I took every single one of those letters and pinned them on my wall as motivation to keep training, to keep getting better, to keep. And so for me, the military was a path to policing, but joke was on me when I fell in love with what I was doing. And even though it was in the big scheme of things, and is in my 20 years of service in the RCMP, my short 3 years in the military was a didn't register a bleep on the radar. And in fact, I didn't go overseas. I didn't do anything of real relevance. And I mean that respectfully. I'm not saying that people have to deploy to war to have relevance, but I am just saying, in the big scheme of things, it was the dead ages of the military. There was nothing to do. I didn't do anything special. We had no budget. I learned to polish my boot, and I learned some self-discipline. I learned how to train to be in shape. I learned how to latch onto a goal and never quit. Those are tools that would help me for the rest of my life. And so, yes, from a personal sort of from a in the sense of a personal growth, it was an incredible decision. In the sense of collective service, I didn't do much of anything when I was there. And so I just want to clear that up, because there are people walking around here that have given a tremendous amount of themselves to service, and I'm not going to walk around and sort of flag the old I was in the military and with all that entails, because it simply isn't the case. But what is the case is that it really helped me as a young man. It gave me a bearing. It gave me a posture in life. It made me stand for something, and it made me understand that if I didn't quit, I could do whatever I wanted. Nobody was going to remove me, you know?
Right. Yeah. So it kind of gave you like a I want to say, I don't want to say accountability, but it gave you like a different mindset. It sounds like it improved your mindset. And I think that being said, I think there's people that maybe come by that naturally, where it's like, okay, I'm going to persevere, I'm not going to give up, right? And there's people who can also let for example, like you saying, rejection letters from different police departments, someone can get one rejection letter from a police department and then give up, right? So I think the mindset that you're talking about is really important. And I think that plays into a lot of what's happening to society today, where it's just that give up mentality, but yet you just persevered through and kept it going. And then you were able to learn a lot from the military as well, that not only is going to, make you say, a better police officer, a better, member of the military, but also within your personal life, I'm sure too, right?
Oh yeah, it was, those are qualities that I sort of, and personality traits that I wish I could take credit for. But of course, there's one thing I did have is a loving mom, and her as a single mom being extremely capable and having, lots of mindset hacks, and her being extremely resilient, and all of those things that were passed on to me. And so I am not suggesting that these things are, were sort of, accidental by any stretch, right? There was work there put in by a woman that's taken on the chin a ton at a very very young age to bring somebody to bear that maybe wouldn't turn into an absolute catastrophe, right? And here we are. But regardless of what happens and regardless of what the circumstances are, we do have a certain amount of influence via free will, and that free will is especially on our reactions and on the way that we process things. And everybody has the tendency to go down the rabbit holes and the dark path when it comes to self-assessment, or when it comes to analyzing what are their shortcomings, or what are the consequences of whatever is happening in your life. And we all have that propensity as human beings, because we are negatively biased, because we're wired for survival. And so being negatively biased is just the rule, it's not the exception. And so then it becomes a matter of override. What am I telling myself when this happens? How am I reacting to whatever it is that's produced in front of me right now? And how can I regain some level of influence over this? And I tell you what, being in victimhood is kind of like being in a passenger side of a driverless bus, where wherever the world takes you, you just go, because you have no control whatsoever, no influence. Whereas if you're sitting in the driver's seat and you're taking ownership of this, and you do not see yourself as entitled to absolutely anything, and that you understand that you must work and apply yourself to anything that's meaningful to you, you're going to quickly understand that the least amount of time you spend in the passenger seat waiting for somebody else to take the wheel, the faster you will get to wherever it is that you have predetermined as an end goal. And if you don't have an end goal, well, then you have to get one, because you're not gonna hit anything you're not aiming at, and the chances of you actually hitting it accidentally, as Jordan Peterson so eloquently puts, is slim to none.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that analogy you used. That's a really good one. You went from the armed forces, and then you went into the RCMP. How old were you when you got into the RCMP? And for those listening, we have some listeners in the States. So for those listening, RCMP is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and they are federal police here in Canada.
Yeah, this is always an interesting question, because I am horrible with time. I can never remember, how old I was or whatever, but I believe I was around 23, and that would make sense because it was in 2001. So I graduated in 2001, and I'm 48. So it should be somewhere along those lines. And I think for me that was probably, I would say, the ideal age to get in. I was too old to be young and too young to be old, and I feel like I was bringing, a pretty solid life experience to this entire journey, which allowed me to take it in stride, and to really enjoy the journey and have fun with it. And this fun extended to the rest of my career, because I had an absolutely amazing career over the course of 20 years. And do I have tiny little grievances and things? Yeah, of course I do, like you would in any other jobs. But I wouldn't even waste my breath talking about those things, because they're so inconsequential compared to how great my career made my life during the time that I was in and after. That it would be ungrateful of me to even speak to those things necessarily.
Right. So what was like the first couple years like? You're fresh out of the military, right? You're a young policeman. Where'd they ship you off to? Because I know with the RCMP, at least, I think back then, they would kind of send you away from where you grew up for the most part. Is that correct?
Yeah, in fact, for me, I asked to be shipped out west. So I was, again, from the east coast of Canada, sort of north of New York by 6 or 7 or 8 hours or so. And I just asked to be shipped out west. Like, I wanted to be thrown with the wolves, so to speak. I wanted to take the experience on and really get myself out of my comfort zone, and really sort of elevate out of whatever state of quote unquote stability, or I would call it, what would be the best word for this? Stagnation, really is what it was. I was in a bit of a state of stagnation, and I needed a real change for me to sort of kickstart this career, you know. And so I was barely speaking English at the time. I was qualifying with some B's, is what we call it. It's basically it's ranked on A, B, C, or D, and B is barely workable in an English environment. And really, I really wasn't. I still thought that bear was beer and all of those things. So just to give you an idea of how low my sort of English orally or comprehension was. And so, but all of this contributed to me having to try that much harder. And when you put that much effort into making something happen really quickly, because you have no choice, if you give yourself no choice and you burn the boats, so to speak, it gives you one choice: succeed. You have no other choice, you know, because you can't. What is the cost of not succeeding in this case? What is the cost of failing at that specific thing? So, there was a lot of failing along the way. Don't get me wrong, but I'm talking overall, keeping your eyes on the prize and really keep working and pushing forward. It was probably one of the greatest decisions of my entire adult life to do that and to really take myself out of my comfort zone.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, it's by the way, your English is amazing. It's way better than mine. So with some of the words you're using. Yeah, it sounds, it's kind of one of those like sink or swim kind of things, right? You got asked to get sent out here, and it's like, okay, well, I got to figure this out, right? You don't have a choice now. You have to make it happen, and you did, right? Where were you first stationed?
So my first posting was in Tofino on the island, on Vancouver Island. So
Okay.
for those of you not familiar with that spot, it's essentially Hawaii with cold water.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like the surf capital of Canada, I think.
We lost a lot. We lost a lot of good men out there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So you spent a few years in patrol, and then you were able to actually get into a different specialty unit. And I don't want to butcher it, but it was basically the equivalent of what the States has for an air marshal. Is that correct?
Correct. So it at the time it was referred to as the Canadian Air Carrier Protective Program, and the job description is in-flight safety officers, as it is now. At the time, it was called something else, but basically the exact same as the Federal Air Marshal program. The only difference is the Federal Air Marshal program is its own entity, whereas the Royal Canadian Mounted Police provide the same service, but through the organization. And so a very, very awesome, high speed, super cool job that I got to travel the world and go all over the world and do all kinds of high speed training, all kinds of combatives training, all kinds of shoot, move, communicate, and have a bunch of fun, and got to travel the world on the Queen's dime, so to speak, and really learn about life in other areas, not just as it pertains to my little reality, my little bubble. And so it was an incredibly insightful 4.5 years that I spent on the air carrier program. And at the time, this was right post 9/11, so there was an actual belief that we were going to get in a scrap. And I think that it was a great way to spend 4.5 years sort of preparing and remaining focused. You know, when you know the fight's around the corner, it's a different feel in how you're preparing and you're sort of how you're engaging your all your senses to make that work, you know, because at any opportunity this could be a thing again. Now we know sort of from a security standpoint that generally when something like this happens, it's the complete opposite. For years this isn't going to happen again because all the security measures that are implemented and all of the things. But in your young brain as a sort of as a covert operator on one of those, you know, you can't let that dictate what you're going to do. You have to assume that it's going to happen again. And so it's a very good mindset to be in once something happened, although extremely unfortunate that it did happen.
Yeah, I would imagine that the training for that was probably pretty interesting because you're essentially in a giant tube in the sky, right? And your firearms training and hand-to-hand combat training, I would imagine, would be quite different. When you were training for that, were they able to provide simulations of what it would actually be like? For example, shooting in an aircraft, right? I mean, you have hundreds, maybe sometimes thousands of people on a plane. If something were to happen, you don't have a lot of room for error there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the program does. It's one of those programs that did a fantastic job of getting people first and foremost to be where they needed to be, marksmanship wise, right, and shooting wise. the first many weeks of the course are spent developing shooting skills at I would say, a surgical level, right? And I'm telling you right now, my shooting now, the shooter I was back then on pistol versus what I could do now are like galaxies apart. I mean, it takes a lot of work and a lot of time is spent specifically on that. And then you have all of the time spent in scenario-based training where you're doing live training with quote unquote live with simulation, right? Where you are actually taking headshots on the move, where you are addressing multiple threats, where you are not shooting at the person with a bomb vest, not doing certain things, and I don't want to launch into too much detail, but the reality is the program did a fantastic job of preparing people for deployments in the context of a tube. And we did push people. There's a lot of training program in policing, and there's a lot of training program in other organizations in the first response world that are coddling sort of the candidates, right? And the goal is to build self-confidence and have them hit the road with some degree of self-confidence. Well, the air carrier program is the complete opposite. We're going to do everything we can to kill you every single time, and you must survive, And so that really was cool for me because I don't want to get coddled. I want to get pressure tested. I want to be put in a pressure cooker and see what happens. How do you know how are diamond
Yeah.
created under pressure? Like I don't want to be coddled, and it's extremely dangerous and we see it on the road nowadays, right? Like obviously.
Yeah, we see it in the fire service too, where there's a lot of people who believe that they're gonna, when shit hits the fan, they're gonna rise to the occasion. But the reality of that is you sink to your level of training, and that's why on this podcast we always talk so much about being dialed, drilling, take time to drill, learn your job, because when the pressure's on, and your adrenaline spike kicks in, and you're not, you think you're going to be calm and you're going to be able to figure it out and stuff. Well, science shows that's really not the case. That's not what happens, right? You tend to panic. So the more that you can train in a stressful environment, the better off you're going to be when you're introduced into that stressful environment for real, right? Were you training jiu-jitsu at the time when you were doing the in-flight stuff?
No, not really. Most of my martial arts experience up until that point was striking arts. So Muay Thai, um, other martial arts, other more traditional martial arts when I was younger, of course. But I would say from my mid-teens to all the way to 2007, it was mostly Muay Thai and Lavoie. So Lavoie is kind of like Muay Thai, but with headbutts, right? And this
Yep.
was perfect because it's actually applicable in a plane, in a tube, where you will not have the luxury necessarily of controlling somebody on the ground. Although if it's done in a galley, might be a different reason, might be a different story, or if you're trying to prevent a takedown, all those things. But the reality is, striking was excellent for me first and foremost. I have an incredible respect and love for striking. I didn't start jiu-jitsu until 2007, which is exactly when I joined the team. So as soon as I joined the team, I went to a jiu-jitsu tournament just to test myself with zero skill to see what would happen. And I had enough sort of ground fighting. I did so much ground fighting growing up, and I did ground fighting at the academy and did fairly well there, I would say, just on account of how much time I'd spent being the smaller kids getting beat as a youth. That I was able to ascertain that there is something here that can be worked with, and there is something here that I think I could be passionate about, and I never looked back.
How was it just going into a tournament with no real formal jiu-jitsu training? That must have been interesting.
Yeah, I actually sort of surprised myself, and I think I surprised myself probably more or so than I would have if I did train. And in fact, that's exactly what happened because I had zero expectations of doing good. There was zero expectations in my mind, so I just got on there, I slapped my opponent's hand, and here we went, and I did what I did, and I got a few submissions, and I have a few wars with some guys that I found out later were much better than me. And so, but the fact is when the expectations are kept low and you just engage in it for the experience and you just engage in it for the sake of growth and self-development, man, you do much better normally than when you self-impose a whole bunch of pressure that you must win or that you must do X, Y, and Z. And so my first tournament probably was one of my better tournaments, and over the years after that, while formally training jiu-jitsu, I've competed quite a bit as a younger belt. I didn't do it correctly at all. I didn't prepare properly. I didn't seek or have the coaching I should have had to do well in tournament. I didn't put enough time on the mats to do well in tournament. So all of it was my fault, really, for not investing enough. But I would say that the rest of my jiu-jitsu journey was pale in comparison to my first time, where I just went in there and had some fun and tested myself and proved that I could sort of defend myself at a fundamental level.
For sure, yeah. So were you hooked after that first
Mhm.
tournament then? Yeah.
Yeah, I was super hooked right away on jiu-jitsu, and I would say I probably dabbled for 6 years, six, maybe 7 years. I was a dabbler. I was training once a week, twice a week sometimes. I mean, by the time I hit my purple belt, I was training twice a day, every day. And by the time I was a brown and right before I got my black belt, I was training multiple times a day, every day, 7 days a week almost, and I was doing everything. I started all the matches standing up. I started sometimes with some striking so the guys would have the opportunity to strike. So I would have to close the gap and survive the onslaught to find a way to the ground and then enact my whatever ground game after that, because the mistake that a lot of cops are making is to train on the ground, on the ground, on the ground, on the ground, but there isn't much emphasis put on takedown mechanisms and how they're going to sort of protect themselves against a good stand-up assault so that
Right.
they may enact their jujitsu.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually a really good point because like I trained MMA for, like probably close to 10 years with at Lance Gibson's place there.
Yeah.
Um and he's the OG of Canadian MMA, right? But one thing that I found when it came to jujitsu was, especially when I did some competitions and stuff, was a lot of people who just instantly want to pull guard, which is great, in the sport side of it. But if you're learning it to learn self defense, and this is something I really enjoyed about your classes, Seb, when I was learning from you. Was you would always make us start standing up, and that's, I think, like you said, like this, especially like in the law enforcement world, they're so focused on the ground fighting, but a lot of the times that fight's going to start standing up, right? So if you don't know how to do takedowns, if you don't have takedown defense, if you can't use basic striking to get you into a better position where you can get somebody to the ground and then start what you need to do on the ground, well then, I mean, you're really doing yourself a disservice in not learning the stand-up aspect that's involved, especially when it comes to self-defense, or if you're a police officer, right? So that was something that I really enjoyed with your classes was, we would always start standing up. And I think for the people listening, and if you're training jiu-jitsu, and you're doing it because you want to learn self-defense, try and start standing up, learn some basic striking, I would say, for sure, because it's gonna make a world of difference, in my opinion. I think you'd probably agree with me, Seb.
Yeah, absolutely. One word of caution, of course, is be mindful of white belt judo. That is extremely dangerous, right? So if you are starting with standing up, make sure that the person with whom you are doing it is either more experienced than you, or that you guys are really taking it slow and playing around with some basic concepts like do not lock knees and do all kinds of stupidness until one of you blows up an ACL or finds themselves, debilitated for a long time. And yes, injuries are inevitable in combat sports. Eventually, as you are engaged in this, eventually the odds are going to be not in your favor, and there is a chance that you might. But the sort of downside of not doing it far exceeds the risk of injuries that you may experience along the way. And this is not even from a self-defense standpoint, but simply from a wellness standpoint. There is so much that is gained from engaging in this. And Dr. Gino Kalura, who's an amazing friend of mine and an incredible scientist, has written an incredible PhD paper that really speaks to the relationship between jiu-jitsu and veterans and law enforcers, and how healthy it is on a variety of different realms. And I think that understating that fact is a massive disservice. So yes, it is great for self-defense. It is great for arrest procedures. It is safe as a firefighter, especially in some areas of the States where, things are pretty messed up. But the reality is what it does for you from a wellness standpoint is highly underrated. And so the point I'm making is just be mindful. White belt judo, as hard as you can, as fast as you can, isn't gonna land you where you want to be.
Yeah, it's a good point. It could potentially be a recipe for disaster if you're if you're doing like what you were saying there, Seb. But you kind of touched on like the wellness side of it too. And like I talk about this, I feel like almost every other podcast, I swear, but we just had Sheena on. So that episode's coming out this week, and I've had Sean Albrecht on as well. And really a big thing about jiu-jitsu, and I think why I harp on it so much and why I think first responders specifically should really be training it is because of the mental resiliency and the ability to train yourself to remain calm in stressful situations. I think that's so relative within the first responder world, whether you're a firefighter, a paramedic, a police officer, a jail guard, whatever it is, that mental resiliency and that ability to remain calm is going to make a big difference in how you act within certain situations, right? So yeah, I feel like that's a big part of jiu-jitsu that I think needs to kind of be talked about more. I'm sure there's quite a few people that are now talking about it, but like you said, it's not just the self defense aspect, but it's also what it's doing for you mentally. It's the benefits are they're astronomical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And calm and chaos is one of the massive benefits of jiu-jitsu, but also I would say from a sort of life lesson standpoint, there are plenty of life lessons there. You can be in the toughest jam you've ever seen in the worst season of your life, and there is always a way out. It's not that you don't have a way out, is that you must find a way out, And so I guess it returns ownership, so to speak, over problem solving certain quote unquote dire or catastrophic issues. And once you've done that in the context of, and you taught yourself that you are capable of problem solving things that are seemingly catastrophic, to eventually outgrow them to the point where something that used to be catastrophic is no longer even an issue, well, you've elevated. Right? And you've elevated, and the subconscious brain doesn't make the difference between this is practice, this is real, this is whatever. All it knows is I've been in tougher jams and I can get out of this,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's so good all around. Right. But I want to talk to you a little bit too about your time in the emergency response team. So you went from, doing the in-flight protection stuff. And then did you have to go back to patrol, or did you end up going straight to the teams?
Yeah, so in 2006, I did my selection on the Lower Mainland Emergency Response Team here, a team we have in Vancouver, everywhere around Vancouver except Vancouver proper. And I did, at the time, it wasn't necessarily the case. There was a few more teams, but eventually it would become that. And I did my selection in 2006. I passed selection. I went on the course in 2006, which is in Ottawa. It was 8-9-ish weeks. I can't remember specifically now how many weeks it was for the basic assaulters course. I was successful in the basic assaulters course, and I returned to the team in 2007 as a brand new, green behind the ears, newly minted operator, so to speak, that didn't know anything about his name aside from his name.
Yeah, yeah, and then you spent, I think you were saying about 16 years. Is that
12
correct?
years on the teams.
12 years on the teams. Okay. But you worked your way up into a leadership position there. So how long did you spend in that leadership role?
So I was a quote unquote element lead from 2012 to 2017. And then I became a overall team leader from 2017 to 2019 when I left. So I was full-time TL, originally with 24 guys. Eventually we split the teams in two. So eventually I ended up having 12 or 14, whatever it was. And but originally as an element lead, I generally would have like 5 or 6 guys, so to speak, you know. And
Okay.
so, and as an element lead, there's a lot of things that you could be doing. You could be, you know, an immediate action TL. You can be a ground TL. You can be a containment TL. You can be, you know, there's a variety of different jobs that need to happen on SWAT calls, of course, that lend themselves to having little leadership element ready to sort of take a little bit more of a proactive role in some of the stuff that we do. And then eventually I would be appointed as the team leader for the blue team, which was my team until I left in 2019.
Okay, awesome. Well, what was your motivation for kind of, working your way up to that team lead position? Was it just you felt like it was just more of a calling, or just more purpose driven in order to get to that point, or was it just something that you eventually kind of just decided you wanted to try out?
Yeah, no, it was really a mix of two things. I always knew I wanted to be a team leader, and the idea wasn't any sort of fake glamour around being the leader or any of that. It was more about having a team that I would have autonomy over, that we could do cool stuff and sort of set the culture as we wanted it to be. Have everybody do certain things like jujitsu, all the things. I had an idea in my mind of how I would like to be as a team leader, and I had been a sort of a element lead and a team leader in the military in a variety of different organizations I was on before joining the force, and I just had a sort of a bit of a propensity for leadership, but I was definitely not a rank seeking leader. I was a positional leader. I wanted to lead to do right by my people. And I'm not suggesting that I've always done right by my people, because part of the leadership journey is really to make some mistakes and to try to avoid repeating them and to learn from them. And that's a conscious decision that comes as a result of that. So certainly not trying to establish this picture perfect image of what I was as a leader, because I had lots and lots of shortcomings, and it took many, many years to become the leader that the guys deserved, right? But it happened almost organically on the teams, as it were, because you start becoming a sort of a veteran at the constable ranks, and the guys are trusting you. You've demonstrated competence over and over again on multiple scenarios when under pressure, and the guys are trusting you and the management's trusting you. And now you being given a senior constable role, for instance, and now you do well with that, and eventually you be given an element and you do well with that, and then eventually and so that's kind of how it happened. There was no real sort of rank seeking antics on my part. There was none of that. It just happened very organically, and and in a very positive way, despite the sort of the learning mishaps and some of the little things that I wish I could have done different at certain times. And but all of that as you know, is in a day's worth of learning, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I like how you said, one of the driving factors for you was to be able to create this, kind of positive culture within your team. And I think that that's huge, man, because I think, some people get into leadership roles out of possibly ego or whatever the case might be. But you were someone who you wanted to kind of get into this leadership role to do good by your team, right? And I think when someone's in a leadership role and that they have that mindset that you have, you elevate your team and your team becomes better. And really, I mean, you really produce future leaders in doing so, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is what this is all about. And I mean, you say, you elevate your team, and then your team elevates you. It's a two-way. And I think there's a lot of leaders out there that are vastly underestimating how beneficial it is to be the leader that you need to be. A lot of people see leadership as a certain way to be that brings them, say, credit, or brings them, posture or glamour or any of those fleeting worldly things that we shouldn't even worry about in the least. And really where the real magic is when your team is giving you much more than you are giving them.
Yeah.
That is where the gift of leadership is. And that is precisely where I was. I trusted the guys with my life. They trusted me with theirs. Their families did. Their wives knew that I wouldn't send them to things that I didn't have absolute, no choice other than that I would work the problem a million times before endangering them in certain ways, that I would be there to support them no matter what, if they ended up deploying lethal force, if they ended up in any sort of jam, whatever the case may be, and even if that meant taking heat. And I think that one of the things that leaders are very reluctant on doing is bringing heat to themselves in the application of their duties as leaders. And if you are in a leadership position, there's two things that you should be really well versed at: strategic communication and strategic actions, right? So understanding what you're asking and what you're asking it, and be very, very solid at articulating yourself in that realm. But also, when all is said and done, you need to be able to take heat. If you refuse to take heat and you're all about self-preservation, it's going to be a long ride for everybody under you. And so I'm not one to jump on every bandwagons that the guys would have and to go to war with absolutely everything, because you end up losing your voice. But I would certainly, the things that were extremely meaningful and necessary were taken on, and they were taken on strategically, but they were taken on wholeheartedly, right? And I think that in a lot of instances, I drew fire to avoid my team, getting in some jams, and individuals on my teams, or whatever the case may be, or if they messed up or whatever the case may be, going to bat for them and doing all of the things that leaders should be doing, and taking hits in the process. And man, if you're a leader and you've been in any consequential leadership position for a long time and you have never taken hits, I'm concerned, with that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think too, like in willing to take heat for your team, of course, when necessary, it just makes them respect you so much more, knowing that you have their back too, right? Whereas if you're constantly trying to deflect that heat and not take, accountability for certain things, well, I mean, that says a lot about the type of leader that you are, and I don't think if you're that type of leader, I don't think you're going to gain a lot of respect from your team, right? And I think, Seb, it's like one of those things where it's I always kind of characterize it as like leaders, in my opinion, someone who's a leader leads by example, right? Takes accountability, cares about their team, does what's right by their team. Whereas, someone who is, quote unquote a boss is in my opinion, somebody who wants to bark orders, who wants to, kind of beat their chest, look at me kind of thing, right? And I think, especially in the first responder world, it's so important to have a leader and not have a boss. And being in a leadership role, you have the ability to really inspire people and the ability to really influence people into doing better, right? Not only at work, but maybe even in their personal life as well, right? If you're somebody that they see as like a great leader, well, one day they might be in that position and they're going to think back to this great leader, Seb, that they had, and they try to mimic your leadership style. And I think that goes back to, like you said earlier, excuse me, about creating a culture of that, right? A culture of being a leader that is going to bring up the next generation of leaders, right?
Yeah, it's succession planning is something that generally is probably 17th on the list of priority on any organization. And really, if you think about it, and how many times have you seen this? This lady in the office, Linda, has done the same incredible work for 19 years. The only problem is nobody else knows how to do it. So
Yeah.
if anything happens, we are falling short of the glory of Linda because because we literally have no clue what she does and how she does it so well, right? And I think that many organizations fall in that trap. It's almost like if I play ostrich, this isn't going to happen. And we know that that's not the case. Contingencies is key to success. And so training the leaders, and I know for myself when I went for 6 or 9 weeks to Thailand to train or whatever, like I never looked back. I never even looked at my phone. The boys had it. They didn't need me. You know what I mean? And when I come back, we talk about things and they tell me something. Yeah, I would have maybe I would have done this a bit differently, but hey man, it worked out and it was totally good. And and so I think having the ability, just as we were talking about, alluded to in parenting, having the ability to offer as much guidance as you can, and once you step off, let the person do what the person will do. They will make their own mistake. They will learn from their mistakes. If there's certain things that can be improved upon, you guys can have a conversation. But the reality is, your job should be to make your people better than you. And I successfully did that because most of the team leaders after me are probably much better than I was.
Right on, man. I love that. Could you, if you don't mind, could you tell us about maybe like one of your most memorable calls while you were in the emergency response team?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of very, very memorable calls when I was on the team, but I think one that sticks out with me the most is probably my first call, which was a hostage rescue in Burnaby, and it was a legitimate hostage rescue, which does I've had four I think in my entire career, like legit hostage rescue, and and that's a fair bit when you consider that there are lots of military special operation units that don't have that, and so I think. Having the exposure was incredibly beneficial for me from a command and control standpoint, from an operator standpoint, from all of the things standpoint, from a human being standpoint even. But my very first call was exactly that. It was a mother-in-law and a daughter held hostage by a concubine and armed with a machete. And it was a really interesting call because we get to see, and of course, I am green as it ever, and yes, I did okay on the ERT course and whatnot, but I don't understand anything about a live ERT call and how it is handled from a command's perspective and how it is sort of sequenced and all of the things. All this is news to me, but the OIC at the time, or the officer in charge, had said very specifically to everybody, keep the newbies away from the scene, like keep them on containment, so to speak, so that we wouldn't mess anything up. And this is long before we had an organized breacher program. Like the team was quite new. Everybody could use a RAM, but we hadn't encountered the amount of barricading and the amount of fortification that we encountered over the next years that would lead us into a complete breacher revamp and have all of the skills necessary to get into strongholds and all of this stuff. And so I was sort of at a distance looking at this, thinking to myself, how would I problem solve this? And I started thinking like I could be climbing because I'm a bit of a monkey, or at least I was before losing my leg. But I was trying to problem solve this in my head in case it came down that input was required, and I eventually like I couldn't help it. I called the TL over and I said, hey, I could get us an entry point on the second floor by climbing on, stealth, so to speak, like quietly, sort of gearing down and have just my soft body armor, maybe my pistol and a knife that could go upstairs and try to jimmy out some windows and do some things. And so he asked sort of the officer in charge, and he says, "Yep, give him the go ahead to do that." And so I end up going up, climbing up this second story window and all the things. And then I get there, and now I'm paranoid because I'm thinking there's going to be stuff on the side of the window, all the things, because the guy probably set up some traps so that if we disturb, he's going to hear it, and then this could launch into an immediate action immediately required. And we don't really have a confirmed entry point, so that's a big no-no. And so I took all the care in the world, and I remember asking baby Jesus, I'm like, baby Jesus, if there was ever a time for me to be opening a triple plane window, without creating a big fuss and having the ability to do it with my knife, let it be right now. And sure enough, it just slides open. It was completely locked, and I jimmied it with my knife, did all of the things. The window comes open, so I gave him a thumbs up. They send me a solid operator to come up top with me, and he gives me a less lethal shotgun, and he goes, okay. Sorry, he had a less lethal, and he gives me a lethal and CW, so taser. So that's a no-no. You're not supposed to kind of mingle with the two at the same time. But hey, man, that's what we had, and I just needed to be very mindful of what I was holding and what I was doing and all of the things. So we end up clearing the top floor, making sure there's no additional bodies in there. Of course, the team is creating all this ruckus downstairs, with sirens and everything so that the noises are muffled, so to speak. And then we stage up on that upper floor, upper suite, and the suspect is right below us in the stairs, maybe 8 steps type deal. And he has a machete, he's holding his wife by the hair, the whole bit. And so eventually we have a sort of a standby, go, go, go. And on the second go, the ram hits the front door. We're going down. I'm deploying the taser. The knife falls on the ground. I kick Buddy. He flies off. And then the team breaches and, they take him to custody. The wife is saved. The mother-in-law is saved. Everybody's saved. And the officer in charge is ecstatic and super happy. And I'm just on my very first call going, wow, like this just, it just was it was a very, very cool baptism by fire. And in my career, and I would say in my life, this is all I know. Every time that I start anything with any measure of sort of commitment, it will guaranteed test me viscerally, rapidly. There's no way for me to just start something and ease into things. As soon as I start something, the whole thing comes loose, right?
That is trial by fire there, dude. Your very first call on the teams, and that's how it goes. That's wild, man. I can see how you really fell in love with the type of work that you were doing, because I mean, to be an ERT member, not only are you working with great like-minded people, but you're going to some of the most high intensity calls there are, right? And for that to be your first call and you just go and figure it out, and that's awesome, man. Thanks for sharing that story.
Absolutely.
So you worked your way through ERT, becoming a team lead and all that, and then you ended up retiring as a sergeant major. Could you just explain what a sergeant major is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly the question I had when I was approached originally. So it depends where you are in the country is essentially the answer to this. It really depends. In a lot of provinces, and historically speaking, the sergeant major is sort of I would say, somebody that's supposed to be trusted by the rank and file and trusted by management, and that has the ability to bridge the gap between the two. So bring the operational realities to management that sometimes can be disconnected, and bring the realities of management to the rank and files, who sometimes forget that there's a world after their own pain, right? And that everybody has to give. And so in BC, in British Columbia, one of the most operational province in the RCMP, the role is really much an operational role. It's more about operational support to the frontline troops. It's more about wellness. It's more about communicating properly. It's more about going to bat for the members. It's more about explaining to the members when decisions are made and why. At the very least, that's the posture that I took during my tenure, and it really depends on where you are. Now, in other places in the country, being the sergeant major means that you are ceremonial. So you're doing, funerals and those types of things, which are things that I certainly engaged in as the sergeant major from an historical perspective. But I did have a fantastic ceremonial sergeant that was way better at any of this stuff than I ever will be or ever was. And so I really focused myself as a sort of adopting a posture of wellness for the troops, and really be there with actionable items. I cannot begin to tell you how many fights I got over into with Ottawa with respect to letting the members work out during the COVID, and having all these memos written and all these conversations. And I took a lot of heat in that position, and I wouldn't do anything differently. This was my job. I wanted to really try to do my very best to give back to the members as much as I possibly could. And I was willing to use some of the influence that come with that one rank, because that's a sole position in the entire province. I wanted to really make use of that. And the person that's in the chair has the ear of the commanding officer. The commanding officer at the time was Brenda Butterworth's car for me, and she hand selected me. And she hand selected me for some very specific reasons that are only known to her. But the fact is, she was 100% expecting me to call her out if things weren't the way. Because the problem in the executive ranks is a lot of people are more concerned about where their career is going than making waves and addressing issues. And so And this is not everybody. There's a lot of good white shirts out there, just like in any organization. And I don't care what people say, that's the case. I've seen people work themselves sick as much as I have with the frontline officers. So I know that that's the case. However, I think, there is a subset of the commission ranks that are all about self-preservation. And I would say part of that is their issue, but part of it is the system's issue. If you build a system in a way that is conducive to want to do that in order to be successful, then you are going to get exactly what you do not want, right? Which is people that are not telling you things the way they are and are acting in a way that's conducive to them saving their careers or directing their careers. And so I really took on the role of sometimes very much being the black sheep and be like, hey, you're quoting this policy for the last 6 meetings, but nobody has actually seen it. Can we get a copy of it? Because what you soon realize is that there's a lot of anecdotal stifling. There's a lot of things that are occurring for no reason whatsoever because somebody said that you couldn't speak to the IIO in respect to member-involved shooting, or you couldn't do X, Y, and Z. And the next thing you know, that policy that is often quoted has never been read by anybody. And when you do read it, it doesn't even say that, right? And so having the ability and the will to take the heat, as we alluded to earlier, is key to a position like this. And I really stuck my neck out on that position, and I absolutely loved every minute of it.
Yeah, I was just about to say that's. It seems like it's a position where you're really putting yourself on the line there in a lot of different ways, right? You're kind of working out almost as like a middleman between management and the people on the front line. And I'd imagine it's not always easy to navigate, but it sounds like you did your absolute best when it came to advocating for those frontline officers, because I think, and this is true in the fire service too, I think, and like you said, not all people wearing white shirts are like this, but I think when it comes to management, there's a big disconnect sometimes on what's truly happening on the front line. Someone, who's been in management for, 10 plus years, who hasn't, ridden on the back of the fire truck, or hasn't, been on the streets in a policing, capacity. There's a disconnect there, and things have changed over the years and stuff. So I'd imagine it was probably pretty tough to really try and negotiate at times with certain individuals.
Yeah, it always is. I think that some of the things that are highly underrated when it comes to making things happen in any position is two variables that are often most forgotten about. First and foremost, know your stuff absolutely inside and out. Know your stuff. There is nothing more terrifying to somebody that likes to throw their ranks around or that likes to throw stuff around than somebody knowing their stuff. And it's really hard to deny if you really know your stuff. And then the second piece to this is articulate your stuff. So it's not just about knowing your stuff. It's about having the ability for articulation in a strategic delivery. You can't go head to head with everybody. As Patton once said, if you go, what was the actual quote? The person who flanks or he who flanks first wins. Right. And I think that sometimes there's good people out there that have a lot of knowledge and they have a lot of experience and all the things, but their strategy is frontline assault at all times. And people, get defensive and it prevents the collaboration. It prevents communication from being effective, all of those things. And so having all of the abilities, skills, knowledge, and abilities, and having the method of delivery is key to making things happen where everybody else before you failed. And I think that's a very, very important, sort of combination to have. And so I wasn't perfect at it by any stretch of the imagination, and I do not want to make it sound like I was. But I'll tell you what, I did everything I could to try to increase those two things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. So let's talk about retirement a little bit here, because you retired in 2001. I think it wasn't too long after that I had actually met you at the gym, doing jiu-jitsu and stuff. But you retired, and then you decided to pursue a master's in counterterrorism. So, most people who retire, Seb, they kind of set sail off into the sunset, and they have a couple hobbies that they do, and stay busy and stuff. But I mean, you kind of took it to a whole different level with getting a master's in counterterrorism. What was your motivation behind that?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, so that was in 2021. And, I think this was not your typical retirement. So it wasn't a retirement as in I'm financially free and I no longer need to work. It was a
Mm,
retirement from policing. I knew I would have to continue working. I wasn't financially in a position where I could just cruise in the sunset and sort of chill out and go to Iceland and do all kinds of things. Like I literally needed to work, right? I needed to continue working in whatever capacity, but I knew that I could do whatever I wanted. So I wasn't stuck in a prison, so to speak, with the keys in my pocket. There were other things in life I wanted to view and experience, and I wanted to change the lens by which I viewed the world. And so I made a decision, which was a very difficult decision, to leave a place of safety and comfort for the open world. And that is terrifying, and if it's terrifying, it's probably good. so
exactly.
so I did that. But I think the Masters of International Security, Global Counterterrorism was something that I'd been wanting to do my entire career, but the time just wasn't there. The time wasn't there for me. I was so engaged operationally and so engaged in my regular duties and family life and all of the things. But really, that was an obsessive period of my career where obsession was required to be at the level at which I was, and for me to be able to stay there with the guys, the savages I was surrounded with. And so I never had the chance to really bring my academic background in line with my operational background. And people can say whatever they want about academia, but academia and operational reality need to intersect. Because if they don't, then there is something missing. So if you have too much academia and no operational background, and if you have too much operational background and not enough academia, then both of those things are not the ideal scenario. The ideal scenario is to meet at the intersection of both of those things. And for me, it was sort of an unachieved thing. It was something that for myself personally, I felt I had sort of slacked off on, and I should have done when I could have done and would have done and never did, and kind of thing. And so I wanted some closure in that sense. And I really wanted to go to school because I love to learn anyways. And so I did take on the masters, and I did take on this. And there was some, curveballs because I ended up, having the situation with my leg, all the things. But the reality of it is, 2.5 years later, I graduated with a degree, and it opened up my mind. It was an international degree where I had people from all over the world looking at the problems with different lenses, doing all of the things. And what it did is to show me that despite being open-minded, despite having all of this knowledge, I was stuck in my ways in a lot of ways, and I was stuck in looking at life through the lens of an operator, or through the lens of a cop that'd been a cop for a long, long time, through the lens of somebody that had an inherent negative bias towards humanity and all of those things. And I think that it really opened up my horizons, so to speak, to engage in that pursuit, and notwithstanding making me maybe a little bit smarter, maybe learn a few words, maybe able to spend better time or more quality time critically analyzing things. Because the one thing that academia does well, if you're in the right program, is teaching you critical analysis and actually reference it, not just like, oh, I saw this reel on Instagram, let's have a conversation, right? Like, and so I really learned a ton on the academic process, which would eventually come in handy for the book and a variety of other endeavors I've been engaged in, right?
Awesome, man. Yeah, that's awesome. Speaking of the book, actually,
Mhm.
let's talk about that. So, The Warrior and the Garden. So, I know I believe it's co-authored with Sean Taylor. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So, he's a awesome badass dude. I've watched him on a lot of podcasts too. It'd actually be cool. Maybe I should reach out to him and maybe see if he wants to sit down and chat with me one day. But tell us about the book.
Yeah. So the Warrior in the Garden is a almost 5-year project. It really started excuse me, it really started in 21 between Sean Taylor and I. And Sean Taylor and I didn't even know each other, but somebody, a mutual friend, had said, you know, you guys need to meet. And Sean Taylor, for those of you who are interested, he was a tier one special operator who eventually became a coffee shop owner, who wrote a computer engineering book, who became a world champ mountain biker and taught world champs mountain biking, 24 hours solo endurance racing, all of the things. He's an absolute savage and a man of many, many talents and an incredible human being with a giant heart. And that's why I love him. But Sean and I were connected through a mutual friend, and she said, you know, you guys are going to hit it off. And of course, as it is sort of explained in the book, I jumped in my wheels and I went and I drove 7 hours to go to a jiu-jitsu class where he was so we could meet, you know. And one thing led to another, and eventually we'd be working on this project together. So the very first time that we sat down to start tossing around content for the book, I rented a hotel room in Roslyn, and we sat in there, 7, 8 to 10 hours a day for 7 days. And we really did a ton of recording. And then as as we finished the recording, we realized there was a lot of holes. There was a lot of things that we needed to work on. There was a lot of friction at all points, including with editors and translators and all kinds of things. And so we're having issues seemingly incessantly. And so generally when that's the case, that's sometimes an indication of, hey, let's sort of put this on the back burner a bit, do a little bit more work, figure out where it is that we want to go, and not abandoning the project or quitting on the project, but rather just realizing we need a tactical pause here because we're pushing rope uphill at every opportunity. And sometimes that's not always a good thing. And so, and whether or not you understand that you need to persevere or you understand that you need to tactically reposition is a question of experience and intuition. And for us, we both felt that maybe the time wasn't right, and we were totally correct. And so fast forward to 2025, we met at my house in Alberta for 10 days of recording, and that was recording absolutely all of the content that we have in the current manuscript. And so this morning I was reading chapter 1 of the manuscript because we've changed sort of the way that it is delivered, because our target audience has the attention span of flies a lot of times now, because they're the younger folks that have, TikTok instead of reading books and all the things. And so keeping them engaged in an academic style reading is going to be very, very difficult. And so I do love writing academically, but unfortunately, I'm not reading it. Somebody else will. And our target audience, the people that we believe can really use some of the shared wisdom in that book. And I say shared wisdom with the utmost amount of humility, because it's us having these high level conversations with like neuroscientists and psychologists and all kinds of highly performing athletes and operators and all of the things to bring sort of lessons to bear for the younger generation in terms of wellness. And we addressed it holistically. Now there's a lot more to the underlying and the underpinning of that book, but I'm not quite ready to share that yet. There is some sort of inspiration that was a little bit on the spiritual side for that book as well, but I will keep that for when the book is out and people have actually, sort of seen it. But if you are familiar with the adage, it's better to be a warrior in the garden than a gardener in the war, then the title makes sense. But if you look carefully, it's the warrior and the garden. And the reason why that is because we're not only looking at optimizing the warrior, but we're also looking at optimizing your garden. So you can do all the things right to optimize yourself, but who do you keep around? What are some of the things, the environmental factors that are still influencing your lack of wellness or your inability to align your mission, vision, and values? Those types of things. And so we really it's a play on word to make it known that we address not only the warrior, but also the environment in which the warrior operates. And of course, it applies to absolutely everybody. It's a metaphorical warrior, not an actual warrior.
Yeah. Dude, I'm so excited for it, man. When I saw, I think on your Instagram maybe not too long ago when Sean was over at your place recording, and you had a few other people there as well, and then I think you had mentioned something about a book, right? And I was like, oh, what's this about? So I was looking at it on your Instagram and stuff, and I'm super excited for it to come out, man. Do you have a date in mind or are you just kind of rolling with it whenever it comes out, or?
Well, no, I mean, now we're at crunch time, right? I have a publishing house that I created for this. I have a cover, everything's kind of, getting ready to go. The thing is we want to make sure that the final manuscript is exactly what it needs to be. And whether or not that's going to be highly successful or not is completely irrelevant. What we can do is what we can control, or what we have influence over is how much effort we put in. And so I think it's important as young authors to to really hold back on the pressure of releasing it, because everybody has been waiting for a long time, some people since 21. And so it'd be easy for us to get sucked in this, what does the people want, and then for us to sort of compromise on what it is that we want to accomplish with it and how we want to accomplish it. And so I think it was a critical piece of it, was to have the poise and the self-control of not releasing it prematurely until it's ready. And so right now, the tentative date was November, but Sean Taylor is heading over to Asia for a month, I think in November, and we don't want to do anything while he's away. So we're looking potentially now at January. So it could be January, and as late as February, depending on if we hit some hurdles with the publishing or the printing or whatever the case may be. Because there is a ton about this process that I am unfamiliar with, that I will be having to work my way through. And so, but the fact is, it's in the next, couple months. It's like it's in the next 4 or 5 months, at the very maximum 6. But I could not. I am not anticipating that being the case. I think it's going to be more around the January mark type deal.
Awesome, man. Yeah, I'm excited for it, and I get what you're saying when it comes to there's so much behind the scenes stuff when it comes to writing a book. So, my oldest brother, he's a police officer, but he's also a published author. He has about five books out. But I saw how much work it was for him to go through that, and dealing with publicists and dealing with editors and agents, and there's so much behind the scenes stuff, and it's I mean, it's for a lot of people who are interested in writing a book or whatever. I mean, writing the actual book is only half of it, right? The other half is all the other stuff that goes into it, right? So yeah, like I said, man, super excited for it to come out. I'll be watching closely for that for sure.
Awesome.
I want to switch gears here a little bit, Seb. Recently you posted something on your Instagram that really I think is really powerful, but also it really hit home for me. But I'll just read it first, and then if you don't mind, I'd like to discuss it a little bit. And this has to do with an incident that happened in the United States, where a Ukrainian-born refugee was on a subway and was stabbed to death by a random person. And I just want to read off the last kind of 2 paragraphs that you wrote off here. So Seb wrote, "To the men out there, society has gutted your purpose, leaving so many of you wandering, questioning the very core of who you are. If you chase external validation, this life will chew you up and spit you out. But if you seek meaning, real meaning, anchor it in doing what's right. Take the harder, less traveled path. It's often said that with the right people, you can do no wrong, and with the wrong people, you can do no right. Yet right and wrong are screaming at you while you drown them out with self-justifying narratives. Nothing will lead to greater outcomes than answering that voice you keep suppressing. There's nothing wrong with longevity unless it costs you your soul. Better to die on your feet for compassion and love than to let your soul die through inaction, only to have your body buried decades later." So that's like when I read that, Seb, I was like, that's so powerful. And an incident happened in Vancouver actually a couple of years ago, where a man was stabbed to death at a Starbucks in front of his child. And I saw the video of it, and I don't recommend people to watch anything like that, but I saw the video of it, and something that really upset me and frustrated me was the amount of specifically men that I saw in the background of that video that took no action. Um, there was even one guy who was sitting right beside the whole incident, and you can see clear on the video that he looks over at this guy bleeding out on the ground and then takes a sip of his coffee and then looks the other way. What is happening in society? I feel like masculinity in a way has really been villainized to the detriment of society these days. And when you wrote that, like I said, it really hit home for me, because it was how I was feeling a couple years ago when I saw that incident happen. And it's saddening, man. There's a lot of, I think there's a saying out there that says all it takes is for good men to do nothing, for evil to prevail, or something like that, right? What do you think's going on today? Like, it's heartbreaking to see that, there's so many people who are willing to let somebody else, bleed out and die and not even try and intervene or help.
Man, I mean, that is a massively convoluted answer, right? And I'm not sure I can make it justice. I mean, I think fundamentally there are many disconnects. First and foremost, we have the emasculation of men, which is real, and the concept of masculinity is toxic, whereas the lack of masculinity is toxic. Real men do not beat their wives. Real men do not victimize the weak. Real men do not, it's the absence of masculinity that makes a man act in a way that's perceived as toxic, not the masculinization of men. And so that's one piece. Then you have the fact that we will literally have zero forgiveness for anybody attempting to do anything that doesn't work the way it was intended to, and what the repercussions would be. We got people losing their job for having an opinion. We got people, the list goes on and on. And then you have the fact that we have taken physicality away. We have taken physicality away from men. Like we have connected them to devices. Their brains are sucked in these TikTok videos and all the crap that we watch and all the things. And very few men are out there training, getting ready for things that could foreseeably appear in their future. And a lot of them have completely lost touch with what it feels like to be threatened. So we have lost sort of a survival mechanisms. And in fact, there is some evidence that's being documented as we speak to show a shrinkage in some areas of the brain that used to be associated with self-preservation. And that is happening because we do not fear for our lives and we do not have to defend ourselves. We're living comfortably. We're doing all of the things. And then you have the fact that we have made life so absolutely comfortable that the prospect of losing it for somebody else is preposterous. And now you start looking at how disconnected we are from each other. We don't call each other. We don't write each other. We don't have, we don't stop by without giving 17 days notice. And the person is spending 17 hours cleaning their place before you can show up. Whereas before it's just like open the door and walk in, So we have all these compounding issues. And this is a few of a very long list of issues that we have as a society. And then we are promoting victim mentality. So everybody's a victim. Everybody's a victim of everything. Everybody's entitled. If you are entitled, the first thing you'll be entitled to is safety, right? I'm entitled to not be, I don't know what this guy has done to this guy to deserve being stabbed. And in some instances, there may be value to this. If two gang members are shooting each other, by all means, just take cover, so to speak. But I think that having the ability to intuitively know the difference, and especially understanding that the little girl was watching daddy bleed out while you were sipping on your coffee is to me is an abomination. And I'm going to say this. I'm going to treat that person with a certain level of compassion. Because that person, if that person has any heart, that person will never recover from that. They won't. Because you think that what you saw was disturbing enough, what they did is unforgivable as
Mhm.
far as they will be concerned. And for them to look at themselves in the mirror for the rest of their lives. And so that's why I said die on your feet, and I mean that in, I'm not trying to catastrophize everything, because there are ways to address certain threats without necessarily dying. Like if you grab a chair or a bench or whatever and smoke them across the head and somebody else jumps in, and there are I'm not saying not to be strategic about what you are doing, but doing nothing, good luck living with yourself, right? And that man that took a sip of coffee while the other guy is bleeding out in front of his daughter, I suspect that there isn't going to be a lot of reprieve for him from an emotional standpoint for the rest of his life, and perhaps after, right? Who knows? But I think that we really stop. As a society, we really need, especially as men, we really need to stop about all of the noise, thinking about all of the noise, because the noise is just that, it's just noise. We still have to do certain things, and we have to be willing to do them. Now, the question is, are you prepared to do them? Are you physically, mentally, and emotionally prepared to do them? And have you made this decision long before it happens? Because this isn't going to be a game day decision. That decision has to be taken in advance, because if you are to do anything meaningful in that context, it's going to have to be done decisively and very, very rapidly. So there is
Mhm.
no time for the person to turn around, reset, recalibrate, and re engage, right? I don't know if I'm making any sense, but just imagine this. Imagine you're witnessing this, and as it occurs, you're on his back immediately, doing things, and there is no chance for him to sort of turn around and address a different threat now and have a different point of focus. He's still focused on doing what it is that he's doing, while you are taking the attention away, while you are coming in and doing something from a place of relative safety, even though there is an inherent risk to it. But if something happens to you in that pursuit, man, you were a better man than 90% of human right now, you know? And
Absolutely.
I'm not talking about it from an external validation perspective. I'm talking about it from you looking at yourself in the mirror, your family, knowing, just imagine, and I was having this conversation with my wife, just imagine being the wife of one of the guys that stayed in the background when Irina Sarutska was killed in the subway, and watched her. What do you think that does to your wife? What do you think that would do to your family? What do you think that would do to you? You know? And so,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I hope that I'm making myself fairly clear. Like, the idea isn't to be reckless in the way that we're doing things. You can do things strategically, but you need to have made some critical decisions long before these things happen.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, and what you're saying absolutely makes sense. I just don't know how a man can look at himself in the mirror after knowing that he could have potentially helped save someone's life, but decided not to. It's just and like you touched on earlier too, like a little bit about, like, there's this notion going around that masculinity is a toxic trait and all this stuff, which is a load of bullshit, because masculinity is such a positive thing, and I think what happened is a vocal minority has taken that and turned it into a negative. Oh, well, it's, masculinity is, like you said earlier, beating your wife or doing this, doing all these bad things. Well, no, that's just a toxic trait. Anybody can have that toxic trait. That is not masculinity. Masculinity is, stepping in, right? Helping people that need the help, right? Protecting your family, taking care of your family, taking care of others, right? To me, that's what masculinity is. And this whole notion of masculinity being toxic is just, it's absolutely ridiculous, because there's toxic people no matter what. There's bad people out there no matter what, but masculinity is not something that's toxic. And I think I'm pretty sure you guys even had a conversation maybe about this on the collective, but we're in a time in our society where I think so many young men are, so used to are so used to being told that, the natural things that they're supposed to do is wrong, and it's just sad, dude. Like, it's tough, like when I talk to people about, doing jujitsu and doing all these different things, and being a firefighter, and I talk to a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, like I would never, I'd never need to do jujitsu or this and that. I'm like, well, what about, don't you want to protect your family, man? Like, don't you want to know, God forbid something happens, right? But don't you want to know that if something were to happen, that you have the capability to protect yourself, your family, protect others? And I don't know. I don't know if we just live in a society where, everyone's just glued to their phones and they just don't care about, some of they're more concerned about external factors, like their Instagram and all that kind of stuff, as opposed to, the real meaningful things in their life. And yeah, it's just sad. It's sad to see, man. It's sad to see men, who don't take action in situations like that. And it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and it's a blatant. There is a concept in tactical operation which is called priorities of life, right? And when you make a decision, you always have to weigh in whose life should be prioritized in that moment, right? Whose life is the most at risk and whose life should be prioritized in that moment. So I'll give you an example of this. So say we're sitting on a house and we have a criminal barricade inside. The guy committed an armed robbery and he's inside and he says he's going to shoot the cops, do all the things, whatever, whatever. You have all the times in the world if he's alone, right? Because the
Mm-hmm.
priority of life in this case is the officer's life take precedent over his, and the public is safe because he's isolated, he's X, Y, and Z, all of those things. Now, you hear all of a sudden through the grapevines or through the information gathering that there is a missing exchange student that's supposed to be living there and that person is potentially inside. Now it just switched. She takes precedent over the cops. So now you have to commit to the space or do whatever you need to be doing to prevent her from being hurt over you. The rest, if you don't do that, and we saw that at Uvalde, Texas, where they stood in the hallway where, don't get me started on that story, but that was a blatant inversion of the priorities of life, right? And so the same is true in the context of regular life. What is actually occurring here? And if you're prioritizing being canceled, or you're prioritizing how you're going to be treated on social media, or you're prioritizing how safe you can be right now, all of those things, it's an inversion of the priorities of life. You are essentially prioritizing futilities over life, you know? And I'm not suggesting if you have zero abilities to interfere physically, all you're going to be is an additional casualty, and there is no way for you to tactically or bring attention or do anything. Well, react, yell, run behind a car, do something. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not. I want people to understand here. Like, it's easy for a guy that spent a lifetime dealing with violence to talk about how you would deal with violence, but it's much less obvious to the person that hasn't, right? And I have a
Mm-hmm.
lot of compassion for that person. I truly do. If you remember, in Saving Private Ryan, we know the guy that was a translator. Do you remember him?
Yep.
Upham or whatever his name was. I mean, a lot of people were super angry at him, and I was just watching it through the lens of compassion. Like, if he's got no capacity for violence, and there are lots of people out there like that. And so I am not saying here, go play hero and endanger yourself catastrophically if you absolutely have zero chance of doing anything. But there is a lot of other things that can be done, whether it's taking a little bit of risk by yelling while running away, or going behind a car, or grabbing a chair or a bench, or getting the guy that's 275 pounds of muscle that's sitting next to you and saying, let's do something. I don't care what it looks like, but realize that we need to have each other's back no matter what. And the day that we stop having that as a society is the day that we fail miserably. And we're already seeing, the cost of the division that we've been sort of under for the last, I would say, decade, like a
Mm-hmm.
solid decade of being as divided as we'll ever be. And what's the reason for that? Well, we're not facing adversity, man. We're all super comfortable in our own little lives. We're worried about our little iPhones or the little earpods, and everybody lives in a bubble and all of the things, I think that we are evolving technologically and we are devolving in a humanitarian way.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, man, 100%. It's, I also think that there's still a lot of, great men out there that are doing great things. Yourself, Jocko. There's a lot of, Jordan Peterson. There's a lot of people out there who are, you know, doing a lot of great things and shedding a lot of light on this topic as well, right? So yeah, thanks for having that conversation, man, because it's when I saw that you posted that, I was like, this is exactly how I feel. I just don't, I'm not smart enough to articulate it the way that you are, so yeah.
Just a lot of time invested in having to articulate the other way around. How am I articulating my actions here? And
Yeah.
this is part of the preparation as well, right? Having the ability, because it's one thing to interfere, but we all know that sometimes the justice system in Canada, you could find yourself on the wrong end. But again, that's an inversion of the priorities of life. If your priority is not to make it to jail rather than helping somebody dying, you got your priorities wrong, right?
Absolutely.
You just do. And there's going to be a way to articulate what it is that you have done, but the best gift that you can give yourself is to do that preemptively. Why would I be intervening if something like this happened? What is my rationale for doing that? And
Hmm.
now we have examples after example. So you can actually use that at quote unquote case law, so to speak, to say, look, the last time that three people didn't intervene, all these people died. And I know
Hmm.
that.
Exactly.
And I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6, or judged by 12 and then having to live with myself and haven't done nothing.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So Seb, what's big for you for the rest of the year? You got some goals that you're trying to accomplish. I know you're hoping for the book to be out by January, February. What else is going on?
Yeah, I'm doing a master's of theology right now, so I'm spending a lot of time in the books. I'm having an incredible time. I mean, my first master's was in line with my area of expertise, so you can you can start thinking that you're better than you are at academia because you're so familiar with all of the concepts that are being discussed. But right now in theology, I'm being academically challenged very much, and I love that. I just love the fact that it forces me to elevate in a completely different field. So I spend a lot of time in the books. I spend a lot of time, scripture readings. I spend a lot of time doing all kinds of things. And so there's that, and there's the piece at which has been underlying to the last couple of years, which is trying to establish some level of financial freedom so that I can be here with my wife on the farm, take care of the horses, potentially have a not-for-profit retreat to train first responders, pre-response, those types of things. Those are things that I have in mind for the foreseeable future. And the only way for me to make that happen is going to be to have some level of financial freedom. And so making some moves, having lots of irons in the fire, and just continuing to sort of push in many different directions, but in a sort of organized way, not just pushing in any directions and hoping that something gives. And with a little bit of divine assistance, I should be able to sort of make some of those things come to fruition and have the ability to perhaps even launch on a book tour after the book, if everything goes well, and have some very, very needed conversation. I'm going to go with the flow here. There's a lot of things that I want to do and a lot of things that I will inherently do, and those things are generally not intersecting necessarily. And so,
Awesome, man. I love it, dude. I love it.
So we have just created our Patreon program and it's online. We'll put a link in the description of this episode. It's got all our freebies on there. So it's got resume templates, the interview checklist,
The competitive edge checklist.
yeah, competitive edge checklist.
And we're also going to be diving into more in-depth interview episodes and hiring process stuff. And we're going to be posting it on there. It really does help us out because then we're able to pay Francesco for producing this podcast. If it wasn't for him, we'd be hooped.
You guys missed the part where we were just trying to turn this microphone on before this episode.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we wouldn't be anywhere without him. So we'd like to start paying him a lot more.
And it's also going to be a way for us to just upgrade to better audio equipment, better cameras, better lighting, and all that kind of stuff to bring you guys a better experience with this podcast.
Yeah, and that was your idea actually, Dan, with the whole going over every interview question kind of in depth and really getting into the interview panel stuff.
Yeah, we'll be going into that in really great detail, really breaking apart the questions and just talking about like what they're actually asking in these questions, right? And yeah, it's going to be good. It's going to be a lot of info, a lot of really, really good info.
And if it's not, let us know. We also have a chat group in there as well on Patreon.
That's right.
So if there's, guests you want us to see, bring on, or if there's questions you want us to ask or talk about on the podcast, you're more than welcome to ask us on there.
Yeah, for sure. sure. And like when it comes to those behavioral slash situational type questions, you know, we can break down a question and talk about it for probably half an hour.
Yeah.
Right. Just one question.
Easily.
So there's going to be a lot of really good info on that. And like we said, it's going to really help support the podcast so we can upgrade better equipment and also keep Francesco around so that way there is a podcast.
Like chaining him down to the table would be too cruel.
Yeah. Right on.
Yeah.
Seb, thank you so much, dude, for taking the time to sit down and chat. And you know, this is like I said, this was a podcast episode that I've been excited for a long time, and I'm glad that we were finally able to make it happen. And yeah, man, it's been awesome. If people want to learn more about you or follow you or whatever, do you mind just throwing out your social media handle and so they can look into the book and look into you and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, sure. So probably the best way to catch a load of me is probably my Instagram at Slav. So SLAVCCMDR. So that's Slav Cobra Commander, which was my nickname on the team. So SLAVCCMDR. I'm sure you'll link it somewhere in the release of this podcast. But that's probably the best place to start. I do have an email address if there's a professional inquiries like coach, guest speaking appearances, coaching, mentoring, whatever the case may be. And that's at Raven Strategic with a K. So Raven Strategic spelled with a K.com. And that's my actual website. And you can contact me on there as well or on Instagram. But really, man, I really appreciated this refreshing sort of interview with so many things that we sort of talked about. And a lot of those things I haven't sort of dove into in quite some times or not nearly in as much depth. So I really appreciate you for that.
Thanks, brother. Yeah, no, I appreciate it, dude. And hey, listen, good luck with everything. Hope to chat with you again soon. And yeah, man, just keep riding the wave.
Done.
All right, brother. Take care.
You bet.